Chapter 33, The Great Depression and the New Deal, 1933 to 1939. This is an extremely important chapter. It may even be the most important chapter in the whole book. And the reason being is it deals with one of the most heavily tested presidents, FDR. It deals with the Great Depression, which is a huge tragedy, huge moment in American history. And also, you see a huge shift in power, where the federal government assumes a ton of power and changes its role and takes an active role in individuals' lives and passes a ton. The Congress passes a ton of legislation to try and fix and remedy the Great Depression. And unfortunately for you guys, you have to memorize the names of a lot of these laws and the agencies, the alphabet agencies that are created to run these different laws. So this is a very, very heavily tested chapter. So the election of 1932 was a big one. You had Herbert Hoover, which remember during the 19-teens and the 1920s, he was considered to be, an American hero, a world hero. Actually, saved the Belgians from starving to death during World War One. He was considered to be an economic genius, and yet look what happens. The Great Depression happens on his watch. So he really had no chance for re-election. It was probably a poor strategic decision on the Republicans' part, even. And their platform, to be honest with you, was similar to Barack Obama's in 2012, and that's that the worst of the recession is over. The economy is going to get better. Now the difference is, that it worked for Obama and it didn't work for Hoover. The Democrat challenging him was Franklin Delano Roosevelt, otherwise known as FDR. He's a distant cousin, or was a distant cousin, of Teddy Roosevelt, and he was a governor from New York. Typical Roosevelt, grew up in the lap of luxury, and he was backed. He was supported by a close group of youngish intellectuals, collectively called the Brain Trust, and a lot of them were professors at Ivy League schools, and they had theories on how to fix the economy and how to change government, how to change society. And you'll see that once he's elected, he puts these policies in place, and the Brain Trust operates almost like a kitchen cabinet. What you see in this election for the first time really is the shift of African Americans from Republican allegiance to Democrat. They were very, very loyal supporters of the party of Lincoln, Abraham Lincoln. And so they voted Republican when they could vote, because you got to remember all the obstacles that were put in place for African American voting during the Jim Crow era. But they were very loyal Republicans when they did vote. And remember all those congressmen that were elected during the Reconstruction era that were black, they were elected as Republicans. However, during this time period, African Americans lived on the fringe of society from a socioeconomic perspective, right? They were already destitute, even in the roaring 20s. And so they were the absolute last ones to be hired. They were trapped oftentimes still in sharecropping and tenant farming. They had pretty crappy factory jobs where they were paid awful amounts of money. And when the Great Depression hits, who were the first individuals to be fired but African Americans? And so FDR, in his, I guess, socialist style fixes to the Great Depression appealed to African Americans, and so they shift their allegiance to the Democrat Party, and frankly, they've been very loyal Democrats ever since. Okay, your book talks about the 3 R's: relief, recovery, and reform. And these were the attempts by the FDR administration and Congress to fix the Great Depression, to heal this economic calamity. And when we're talking about relief, recovery, and reform, you can think of it in a timeline where relief is immediate, quick fix, like a Band-Aid. Recovery would be more long-term, but still in the immediacy. So almost like recovery would be almost like a rehab, like you're rehabbing an injury. And then reform is far longer term to stop this from ever happening again, to put in place safeguards to stop another depression. So the first thing that FDR does, remember he's inaugurated March 4th. This is still when they had that stupid, really long interim between election and inauguration before that was shortened. Within 2 days, he institutes a nationwide bank holiday. So all banks in the entire country are closed. And then he engages in something, a power that the executive has. Whenever Congress is on recess, it's almost like vacation, the president has the power to summon them back to Washington. And he does so. And he summons them back to Washington for a special session, basically to change course with our approach to the Great Depression and try and do it his way. And really, it's the brain trust way, remember? And then Congress does so, and from March 9th to June 16th, they engage in probably the most cumulous amount of legislation being passed in our nation's history, the 100 days. It's funny when you think about it, because nowadays Congress struggles to get anything done in an entire year. And here they're passing all this massive amounts of legislation, a lot of which is still around to this day, within the first 100 days of FDR's administration. And the topics that this covered, they were primarily progressive, populist, socialist in their nature, in their philosophy. And it covered such stuff as unemployment insurance, old age insurance, minimum wage regulations, the conservation, development of natural resources, child labor, and public utilities. And like I said, we're going to go into each of these in fairly great depth, and you're going to have to know the names of the laws, the names of the agencies, and what the strategies were. And different teachers put them in the different categories of relief, recovery, reform. I don't find that as useful because a lot of times those 3 R's overlapped with each other. Very similar to, in a lot of ways, how these different laws actually overlapped with one another. And then there's the whole first wave and second wave dealing with the Supreme Court. And a lot of these bills, they're the same. They have different names, they have different letters, but they are meant to fix the same thing, and they do accomplish the same thing. So here you see a table from your book, and it just gives you an example of all of the legislation that was passed during the 100 days Congress, and all the different areas. And like I said, your book breaks them up into relief, recovery, reform. And you see a whole lot of overlap, but we're going to talk a lot about the Emergency Banking Relief Act, a lot about the CCC, the Federal Emergency Relief Act, the AAA Agricultural Adjustment Act, the TVA, a little bit about the NRI, the PWA, and obviously the Glass-Steagall Act. All of these are extremely important and really change American society. So here we go. If you look at the Constitution, Article 1, Section 8, gives Congress the power to regulate commerce. It gives Congress the power to coin money. If you use the Constitution as a structure to give the government various powers, it clearly gives Congress the power to run the finances and banks in America. And yet, what you see in 1933 is Congress handing over a huge amount of this power to the president. And that starts with the Emergency Banking Relief Act. And it invested the president with the power to regulate banking transactions and the foreign exchange and to reopen and close banks. And that coincides with that banking holiday that I told you about. And this brings us to the fireside chats. Now here's the deal. Those banks that were closed during the banking holiday, we could put them in three color categories. The federal government would go into these banks and check the finances. And if the banks were on solid fiscal ground, they would be in the green, we'll say. And at the end of the bank holiday, they would open up. The banks that were in trouble but salvageable, we'll call those they're in the orange. And what the federal government would do is it would either loan money to these banks or it would help usher in other private loans to these banks to put them on sounder ground. And at the end of the banking holiday or whenever that they were able to uh, get okay, then they were allowed to reopen as well. The banks that were in the red were the banks that were were in deep trouble and we're gonna fail. And so those banks never opened up again. And what this does is when the bank holiday ends and these banks open up again, it's like a stamp of approval from the federal government that to the American public that says these banks that are open are safe now. They're not going to close. You're not going to lose your money because remember what we talked about in the last chapter. Even the rumor that your bank was in trouble would cause you to run to the bank and withdraw all your money. And because you're not the only person that was going to do this, everybody's going to run to the banks. It creates a run on the bank, and the bank without money is going to close up. It's going to be bankrupt. So this is a way of preventing that. Now you still got to convince the American public though to deposit their money back into the banks or to keep it there. And so what FDR does is he engages in a series of fireside chats. At this point, almost everybody in America had access to a radio. And so he did these radio recordings where he reassured the public the banks were safe, that they should take the money out of their bed mattresses or the holes in the backyard and stick them back into the bank. Congress also passes the Glass-Steagall Banking Reform Act. The most important thing about this act is that it creates the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, the FDIC, and that's still around to this day. And this is another way of protecting the American public's money and protecting the psyche of the banking system. And what I mean by that is it started, I think it was $5,000, that if your bank went out of business and you had $5,000 or less in the bank, that the federal government would actually cut you a check for $5,000. So it was impossible for you to lose your money even though your bank went kaput. Now that total has increased and now it's in the hundreds of thousands of dollars to this day. So you can do your banking with the safe knowledge that you cannot lose your deposit if the bank closes. Now, another way of stopping hoarding by people, because you need that money in circulation, is to get America off the gold standard. And this allows far more liquidity for the Federal Reserve, and that they can increase the printing of money almost whenever they want to, because they're not tied to the amount of gold that's in existence in America at that time. In order to do this, though, you have to force the citizens to give up their gold. And so Roosevelt does this, and once you turned in your gold, you would get paper money in return. This worked on the domestic level, but on the international level, with the world was also in the Great Depression, and there was a lot of mistrust of various paper money. You saw pictures during the Weimar Republic, right, with hyperinflation and everybody's rolling around in billion-dollar bills and stuff like that. So Roosevelt was forced to have a hybrid system for a while, where for international transactions, if the foreign country required it, we would do business in gold. But for domestic issues, it was all paper money, and that paper money was not tied to the gold standard at all. And you can see that the Glass-Steagall Banking Reform Act was a huge success. The FDIC is a huge success story of the Great Depression, and is still around today, because you can see thousands of bank failures before the law, and then almost nothing after the law. And again, it's because the American public is not going to panic and run to the bank and take all their money out of the bank, because they know that their deposits are backed, they're insured by the federal government. Now we got to deal with unemployment. Your book talks about that the unemployment rate at its worst reached 25%. So 1 in 4 Americans who wanted to work couldn't find a job. It's actually a lot worse than this, because so many jobs, so many industries, they did reduced hours and reduced pay. And you can imagine if you're a boss and you have four people and four employees, and you don't have the money because it's the depression. You have the money to hire or to keep two of them, right? You're gonna feel awful because you're gonna have to fire two people and they can become destitute and starve to death and lose their homes and all the other stuff. However, you could reduce all of their hours by half and then reduce their pay by half, and that way you could still employ all of your employees and they would all have a job. They would just lose a ton of money, but you know that's a lot better than no money. And so many industries, so many companies did this. So the actual, we'll say, rate of unemployment plus reduced employment was far higher. And in fact, it probably impacted the vast majority of workers during this time period. So one of the government's ways to fix this is to provide work for people. And another fringe benefit is young men typically are the most violent revolutionaries, right? And revolutions occur in times of strife, and this could be categorized as that. So what is a way to appease young men so that they don't revolt, so that they're not violent, so they don't lead to a life of crime? How do you also give them some money, and how do you not harm business, right? Because if the government went into the shoe industry and started building shoes and provided jobs for people to make shoes in a factory, that's fine. They'll have jobs, but they're going to kill private shoe companies. So you got to somehow, come up with a way to pay people to do something, but not hurt private business. And so they come up with the Civilian Conservation Corps, otherwise known as the CCC, and eventually over 3 million men, younger men, went to work in it. You lived in, it was almost like an army base with barracks and tents and stuff like that. And the types you got paid, and most of the money had to be sent home to your family, which is nice, so you don't blow it on booze and hookers. And the type of jobs that you did were, a lot of nature type stuff. So reforestation, fighting fires, draining swamps, building dams, digging canals. If you live in the Chicagoland area, a lot of stuff in the Cook County Forest Preserve, all the trails and the dams and the different ponds that you see, a lot of the canals in the Chicagoland area, they were all built by the Civilian Conservation Corps, because you can imagine how many hundreds of thousands of young men in the Chicagoland area were out of work and needed work. Another thing that the federal government did is they passed the Federal Emergency Relief Administration Act, otherwise known as the FERA, and it just gave $3 billion to the states. And the states could use that money just as straight up money, which we would call now welfare, just cut checks to poor people, or they could, what the federal government wanted the states to do is to use that money as wages, and that the states themselves would have their own mini versions of the CCC, basically. And so that the money they got from the federal government, they would then hand to unemployed Americans as wages for these various projects. This is just a poster advertising the CCC, and those are photos on the left of guys in the CCC. You can see the type of work that one dude's using a jackhammer. Looks like they're tearing away trees, and then when you're not working, apparently you play the accordion and take your shirt off and hug each other. Getting kind of weird. These are later New Deal measures that are another table from your book that talks about past the 100 Days Congress, other legislation that's passed. And you can see just a huge amount that this Congress does in the 1930s. Some that we're going to talk a lot about are the FHA, the WPA, the Wagner Act, the second version of the AAA, it's almost like AAA 2.0, and a little bit of the Fair Labor Standards Act. Okay, the CWA, the Civil Works Administration. It overlaps with the CCC. It just flat out does so. And thousands were employed to basically, you know, do nothing. Right? Do nothing that would compete with a private enterprise. And so they have like raking leaves, sweeping streets, stuff like that. Where in a lot of the times you just kind of stand around and with your rake in your hand and talk and not do anything. So there's a lot of BS tasks. But it wasn't just a straight up dole payment, a welfare check, which was very out of vogue at that time period. And it allowed you to survive, have money for food, have money for rent. They also passed the Work Progress Administration. And again, this kind of overlapped with the CWA and the CCC, but it was more of construction type jobs. And it was more of the government buildings and bridges and roads that needed to be built during this time period. As you can see, they spent $11 billion on it. And the one, and there's a ton of different projects that the Works Progress Administration engaged in. The one that you see tested a lot in APUS history is the Federal Art Project, because they want to get all artsy fartsy and give some credit to American artists over the years. And how do you test about that? How do you pick which artists or pieces of art to test on? Well, in boring APUS style, they actually talk about the law. And so the Federal Art Project actually hired a bunch of destitute artists to paint pictures that they would then hang on the walls of various post offices and other government buildings around the nation. And so you see that this is a way that starving artists, literally starving artists, would be paid by the federal government, and they didn't have to walk around and rake stuff. They could actually paint. All right, the National Recovery Administration, the NRA, not the exciting dudes with guns. This is more of a way to try and build a partnership with different industries and also labor. It was a weird where the government's trying to create a marriage between labor and industry. And it didn't really work, but it was a nice attempt. And the idea was that these different industries would kind of almost have an agreement. They would collude, which is actually illegal, with each other on the number of hours that their workers were allowed to work, with the minimum wage that they would actually pay their workers. Unions would have the actual right now to collectively bargain. Remember all those Supreme Court decisions that said that various unions were illegal and unfair restraints of trade. Part of this also was the Yellow Dog contract. Remember, that's a contract that businesses forced a worker to sign and say that he would not join a union or start a union. Those Yellow Dog contracts are outlawed. And if your industry agreed to do this, then you got this fancy picture of the blue eagle that you could hang in your window. And this was supposed to be an advertisement to the American public that, hey, this business is doing right by its workers, so you should do business there. You should spend your money there. Businesses, they kind of violated this. They didn't really follow this. And the Supreme Court actually declared it unconstitutional in the famous Schechter chicken case, which you don't really need to know the details of, other than it's the case that declares the NRA unconstitutional in 1935. Moving on to agriculture. The Agricultural Adjustment Act, the AAA, it created artificial scarcity. And the reason why is because American farmers, remember, were too good. There were all these high prices, big profits that farmers were earning in World War One because they were the only ones farming. They were feeding the front lines of Europe. And so the price of grain was very, very high. And so farmers were making lots of money. And in addition to that, they then spent some of this money on bigger tractors, more land, more seed, more fertilizer, so that they could plant bigger crops next year and have bigger harvests and make even more money. The problem is that If everybody's doing that, you actually create a huge surplus, especially after the end of World War One, when all of the trenches get plowed over and turned into farmland, and the soldiers from Europe actually become farmers again. And so now you have all this land, all these mortgages, all these loans, and you're still making too much food, right? And so the price of food is super low. And now the only way to pay off your loans is to somehow come up with more money. And the only way to do that if you're a farmer is again to plant even more. So the quick fix on an individual level in the aggregate is bad for everybody. So somehow the federal government has to create artificial scarcity. And so what they do is they just grab grain. They grab livestock like pigs and they kill it or they burn it. Right? And so that food never gets on the market. It's never sold. And it also set up parity pricing. In other words, basement level pricing. You cannot purchase corn, a bushel of corn, for below X number of dollars or cents. The Supreme Court also declares this unconstitutional in 1936. So in the aftermath of this Supreme Court decision, Congress comes back and passes the Soil Conservation and Domestic Allotment Act. So in order to skirt around the Supreme Court decision, which said that you basically you couldn't interfere with this type of commerce, they went the conservation route. So they gave incentives to farmers to, instead of planting, let's say, corn or wheat, that they should just let their land lie dormant, or grow maybe soybeans, which replenish the nutrients in the soil. And that way, this stuff isn't really sold on the market to a great deal, and it's another way of kind of creating artificial scarcity. Now, in the aftermath of the switch in time that saves nine, the Supreme Court battle between FDR and the justices on the Supreme Court, Congress was able to pass the Second Agricultural Adjustment Act in 1938. It's basically a combination of AAA 1.0 and the Soil Conservation and Domestic Allotment Act. And the Supreme Court left the Second Agricultural Adjustment Act alone, and so that's one of the ways that they created artificial scarcity. Now, eventually World War II rolls around, and we need all this food, and so that kind of goes by the wayside. Still on the topic of agriculture, we got to talk about the Dust Bowl. And as I told you, farmers planted too many crops. And out in the western part of the Great Plains, so Oklahoma, Texas, Kansas, some parts of Colorado, it's fairly dry. Lots of grasses, but it's an arid environment. And what farmers did in the teens and 20s is they plowed up all of that ground, and then they planted, right? And they went real deep, and they turned all of that topsoil into finely ground dust, really. And as long as the rains fell, then you can grow plants in there. But it's just a bad coincidence that the rain stopped falling in the early 1930s, and so this dust just blew away, basically, and killed all the crops, and it was real bad. Some people actually died in these dust storms. They asphyxiated, and some really bad biblical type pictures that you see on the internet. And in a weird way, this probably helped the pricing of agricultural goods, because otherwise this stuff would have been on the market. But it absolutely destroyed the lives of farmers in this area. And so much so that over 350,000 farmers from Oklahoma and Arkansas, otherwise known as the Okies and the Arkies, actually migrate to Southern California and just become, almost like just transient harvesters, where they just wander around, picking peas and stuff like that. One of the most famous pieces of American literature is written about that, and it's The Grapes of Wrath, which your English teacher may have forced you to suffer through this year or next. This picture on the bottom right here is probably the most famous picture of the Dust Bowl, maybe even of the Great Depression. And it's about this woman and her three kids who are completely destitute from the Dust Bowl, and they're forced to just walk, hitchhike, and slowly make their way to California, where she eventually becomes a migrant pea picker. This other photo shows you an approaching dust storm, and I believe it's in Texas. And you can see if you saw this just black rolling cloud of dust surging towards your house, you're going to think that the end of the world is coming. And a lot of these hillbillies actually did believe that. This is a map. I think it's from your book. Yeah, it is. It shows you the extreme epicenter of the dust storm, and then in lower degrees where it also affected. Moving on to banking. Congress passes the Federal Securities Act in 1933, which actually required companies to inform investors regarding what's going on with their companies. Because remember the 1920s, tons of people played the stock market, but it was really like gambling in that you couldn't trust uh, any information, if you even received any information, about what type of stock, what the value is, because you have no clue what the company is doing. And so now, after the passage of this act, companies have to, on a quarterly basis, and then have a final year report. These are 8K, 10Ks, if you're a big dork, which the company has to basically say, look, this is how much money we're taking in. This is how much money we have to spend. These are big time lawsuits that we're facing. These are new products that we're rolling out. These are patents that are expiring. Basically, all this information so that you as an investor can decide whether or not to purchase or sell your stock. And then Congress passes the Security and Exchange Act that creates the SEC in 1934, and they're the police agency essentially for the stock market to make sure that companies are actually doing this, that they're being truthful, and that people aren't engaging in unfair stock purchase practices. Basically, insider trading, where you have secret info and you're able to make money off of the secret info, which is unfair. Everybody should have access to all of this info so that they can make as wise of an investment, at least in theory, as you. The TVA, the Tennessee Valley Authority. This was an area in Tennessee that was extremely poor, extremely rural. Almost nobody had electricity, running water. Tons of people were unemployed. And there were lots of cries elsewhere in the country that people were paying way too much for electricity, and they wanted the government to step in. It was a very kind of, remember the populists, how they thought that the farmers were being charged too much for railroad rates, so they wanted the government to take over the railroads. This is kind of the same type of thing with electricity that's going on in the 1930s. And so, the brain trust behind FDR came up with a plan where the federal government would actually get involved in electricity. That they would create the TVA and try and figure out what the cheapest rate is for electricity given all the various variables. And therefore then they could force other utilities to either lower their rates or allow them to be raised. And so the TVA is created. The federal government builds a bunch of hydroelectric dams. That's the Norris Dam that you're seeing there in the picture. And it was a way to bring a certain amount of prosperity to this backwards area of America. There's the TVA, all the dams that were built, all the power plants that were built. All right, housing. The FHA, which is still around today, the Federal Housing Administration, was created in 1934, and it was a government way of providing loans to homeowners. And what they could do then with these loans is either build an addition on their house, repair their house, or perhaps purchase a new house. And so this is going to help homeowners, but this also helps reduce employment or unemployment because if you're going to add an addition to your house, you're going to build a new house, you're going to have to hire people to do so. So the construction industry benefits from the FHA. The government also passes the Social Security Act in 1935, and this is still around today. It's extremely controversial. It's an extreme drain on our nation's finances at this moment, but it also probably saved a lot of lives. It's unemployment insurance. So it initially started out that specific categories of retired workers, so old people, uh, they got paid. They got paid just because they were old, and it was financed with a special tax. And this tax, and to this day, if you look at your paycheck, your pay stub, and you see, FICA and these other various categories of taxes taken out, the Social Security tax is taken out. So you're losing money, and that money is being paid to current old people. And your employer also has to pay this tax. It's almost like a matching agreement. And this is going to take some money away from you, some money away from the company that you work for, but it's being paid to current retirees. And the plan is that when you retire, you will receive monthly Social Security checks just because you were old and because you paid into the system when you were young. So it's kind of like a pyramid scheme in that regard. And initially, provisions were also made for the blind, physical handicapped, and other categories. It's important to note that originally there were only very specific, limited categories of retired workers that got payments. Nowadays, pretty much everybody gets it. The Wagner Act, 1935. It creates the National Labor Relations Board, which is still around today, and they're basically the administrative agency, almost like a judicial branch for unions. And it both allows unions to organize and it also polices disputes, not just among unions, but sometimes between unions and the companies. You may have been paying attention to the news. This is June of 2014 when I'm making this, and recently this spring, football players at Northwestern have attempted to form a union, a college athletes union. It's been all over the news, and one of the first steps is they had to get basically the AOK from the National Labor Relations Board, which they did. They also passed the Fair Labor Standards Act in 1938, and this creates minimum wage and maximum hour levels, and it also gets rid of a lot of child labor. Children were still allowed to work in their family businesses and their family farms, but you start to see them get booted out of coal mines and factories and stuff like that. Also, a lot in the news nowadays about minimum wages. I know that McDonald's workers have had strikes in the Chicago area. At least they're demanding a $15 an hour minimum wage. These two laws really give a lot of power to the unions. Remember, originally, starting in the 1800s and even for a large portion of the 1900s, businesses had more leverage. They had more power than the unions. Well, you really see a shift in balance during the New Deal. And what you have here is a picture from General Motors where workers not only did they go on strike, they actually went on strike on the job and then refused to leave. It's like the opposite of a lockout. It's a sit down. And so they're all sitting there in the car seats. And by doing this, you're kind of preventing scabs from coming in and starting up the factory and doing your job. You can see this is just a chart from your book that talks about the percentage of employees that were unionized. And the thing, if you look at all of these, is even though the United States, we talk about unions in America, at its absolute height, it only approached 30% of employees actually were in a union. Whereas if you look at Sweden, at its height in 1990, 80% of workers were in a union. And you can see that fairly low percentage of Americans were ever in a union compared to the other big hitters in the world. Okay, here comes the battle between the Supreme Court and FDR. You got to remember that you had all these Republican presidents prior to FDR, and they had been appointing conservative members of the court. And then you have FDR in his 100 Days Congress passing all this extremely liberal, borderline socialist legislation. So a lot of these bills, these laws, are then challenged, right? But they got to work their way up the federal judicial process, and then eventually they get to the Supreme Court. And they start to get to the Supreme Court starting in about 1935, 1936. And out of the first 9 cases dealing with this legislation that gets to the court, 7 of them are declared unconstitutional. And, it's along partisan lines. Some things never change. The Republicans of the court say it's unconstitutional. The Democrats say that they are constitutional. There's more Republicans of the court, so it's unconstitutional. So FDR needs to pack the court with some Democrats. So he comes up with this scheme where he asks Congress to pass a law that allows him to add a new justice for every current member of the Supreme Court who's over 70 and who refuses to retire. Eventually, this could amount to 15 total justices. They're pretty old. Not only, and he knew that the Republicans were going to go nuts over this, what he didn't foresee was that the Democrats and the American public would go nuts over this, because it really does. It makes the president too powerful. It makes him appear like a dictator. He was trying to grab a ton of power, because what if you go down this line of thinking that any time a president doesn't like a decision from the Supreme Court, he can just add more people of his same philosophy until he gets the decisions that he wants. At that point, why even have a court? The president can just do whatever he wants then. So he backs away. Right around the same time, one of the conservative members of the court, Justice Roberts, he actually switches his allegiance and he starts voting with the liberals on the court. And he never says why, but this is called, in legal circles and in your book, a switch in time saves nine. And so both FDR's backing away from this and Justice Roberts switching his allegiance is what saves the sanctity of the Supreme Court and keeps it at 9 justices. And really, the aftermath of this, the Supreme Court becomes very sympathetic to New Deal legislation. A lot of those guys die out or actually do retire, which allows FDR to put the Democrats that he wants on the Supreme Court, which are going to be much more favorable to his legislation. This is a political cartoon from your book. And you can see even the Democrat jackass is bucking wild against FDR's proposal to add some more justices to the court. So we've gone over a ton of legislation and a ton of fixes to the Great Depression. Now here's the controversial aspect. Did any of this stuff actually fix the Great Depression? And a lot of people say no. And one of the key pieces of evidence is they point to the economy actually tanked even further in 1937. It was a recession within the Depression. And a lot of economists, a lot of smart people say it's because of all this legislation that, especially the Social Security tax, you're taking more money away from workers. You're taking more money away from businesses that have very little money to begin with. And this is going to stop the ability of people to spend that money. And so, is it possible that the New Deal actually caused more harm than good? And look, it kind of depends on if you're Republican or Democrat and how you answer that question. What is undeniable is that starting in 1937, the federal government changes their philosophy again to try and deal with this, and they engage in Keynesianism. The famous economist, I think it's John Maynard Keynes, if I remember correctly, he was a proponent of planned deficit spending. In other words, if the economy is going poorly, the government should spend tons of money, and this will dump money into the economy. It will prime the pump, and that the best way to improve the economy is to get consumers to spend money. And so, really, ever since then, this has been the method of how the government deals with different economic downturns. And it's trying to get people to spend money. And one of the best ways to get people to spend money is to get them access to money. The problem with this is it increases the national debt exponentially. And you're going to see charts over the years in this class even that we go from the billions of dollars in debt to the trillions of dollars in debt, and then now it's doubling, every 8 years or so. So it's exponentially growing. Eventually you have to pay this debt. Another just kind of random act that is tested, and I don't know where else to put it, is the Hatch Act of 1939. And it was an attempt to make elections cleaner. What I mean by that is it barred many federal officials from active political campaigning and soliciting. Now, obviously, the bigwigs in Congress and the president, the White House, they still could campaign, they could still fundraise, but the lower level guys were not allowed to do that. And it also was an attempt to stop government employees. You couldn't force your employee to campaign for you or contribute, and they took away your ability to abuse government funds for purely political purposes. You could only use them for legitimate purposes. This is a chart from your book that shows the unemployment rates in the United States. And you can see at its height in 1932 in the United States, we're at 25%. Germany is much higher. It goes down. And you can see that uptick in 1937, where unemployment actually goes up again. You can also see on the right industrial production. What I really want you to see there is in 1937, where in America the industrial production rate drops fairly drastically because of the recession within the Depression. Now you see it spike fairly highly upwards starting in about 1938. And the reason for that, of course, is that we start ramping up for World War II, which is right around the corner. Okay, here we have the New Deal or a Raw Deal, as your book categorizes it. And I talked a little bit about the national debt. So in 1932, the federal government was in debt almost $20 billion. 7 years later, which is considered to be pretty much the end of the Great Depression, it had essentially doubled. It's slightly over $40 billion. However, was it New Deal legislation that wrecked the economy? Or, if you look 6 short years later, now those were a big 6 years, it's World War II, the national debt is $258 billion. So it's massive. Like I said, nowadays, as of telling you guys this in early June 2014, I believe the national debt is somewhere in the neighborhood of $18 trillion. So it's going up. It's going up very, very quickly. People who are against the New Deal, they say that the philosophy of Americans changed. That instead of being the self-reliant group of people who hacked an existence out of the wilderness and who were able to beat, Great Britain in the Revolutionary War despite being outgunned, outmatched, out everything, that self-reliance, that the core of what makes an American is lost. And now Americans who are in trouble, who are faced with an obstacle, instead of fixing it themselves, now look to the federal government to solve all of their problems. This is the last slide of the lecture. And you can just see that we start with Roosevelt getting elected in 1932. You have all of that legislation that's passed in 1933 in the 100 Days Congress. You can see that the Gold Reserve Act, the SEC, the FHA is passed in 1934. In 1935, you get the WPA, the Wagner Act, Social Security Act, the Schechter case. 1936, you get Congress's attempt to skirt around the AAA with the Soil Conservation Domestic Allotment Act. You get the court packing plan in 1937. You get the second AAA and the Fair Labor Standards Act in 1938. You get the Hatch Act in 1939. That's it.